Hello and welcome to the programme. Defeating terrorism requires a new approach that tackles not just propaganda, but also organised crime and corruption. That's the argument put forward by my guest, Louise Shelley, one of the world's leading experts on terrorist financing. She's a professor at George Mason University in the United States and the author of Dirty Entanglements, Corruption, Crime and Terrorism. This is the fruit of 15 years of research that took her to the former Soviet Union, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Thank you so much for being a guest on the interview.
It's my pleasure.
Let's start with the Islamic State group, of course. It's something we're talking about daily in the news here. You call this a diversified criminal operation. What do you mean by that?
We talk a lot about ISIS or IS being involved in smuggling of oil. But that's only one of its illicit activities. It's involved in antique smuggling, human smuggling, cigarette smuggling, hostage taking for profit. It has many diverse sources of revenue that allows it to function.
So has it actually diversified these portfolios, so to speak, over the last few years?
It's diversified, and as it's suffering now from bombing campaigns against its oil facilities, it seems to be trying to tax the Captagon trade, which is a synthetic drug that goes from Syria to the Gulf states. So it finds new ways of generating revenues. As one is under threat, it finds new ways to function.
Does it use professional criminals for these purposes, or is it actually, as it were, members of their own in-house staff doing this?
It's a combination, because one of the things that you notice in the recruitment of young jihadis from Europe is that many of them have a criminal background. So it has individuals with a criminal background. It's got people who worked on smuggling networks under Saddam Hussein, and then it has some criminal elements in the ISIS that allows it to function. So it's got a diversified base of personnel that allows it to carry on activities.
But again, to use the analogy of the corporation, it must be outsourcing a lot of the criminal activities in the surrounding countries, perhaps just outside Syria and Iraq.
I can't say that it's necessarily outsourcing them. Some of the corruption in the neighboring countries, in Kurdish Iraq, in Turkey, has allowed for the movement of oil, just as it did in Saddam Hussein's time. But there's also cross-border movement of people, so that there are people from ISIS who are operating in border areas of Turkey. So it's not necessarily outsourcing, but movement in an area in which there's not too much regulation of borders.
Just give us a snapshot of how the corruption is working in Turkey, which is obviously key to the oil smuggling operation. Who exactly is being bribed? How is that working?
There's been a tradition of small-scale smuggling and larger-scale smuggling, and this has been in place for a long time. So some of these smugglers are just moving now the oil from Syria. Sometimes they're being paid off. Sometimes they're being threatened if they do not comply with these smuggling networks.
I want to ask you about the illicit economy, because, of course, ISIS also uses the international banking system. So if you could just explain a little bit about how that works and how the Gulf states fit into that.
It's not as clear how much ISIS is reliant on the international banking system. If we can think about trade in the region, I mean, the first written documents in the world date back to Mesopotamia, which are trade contracts. So a lot of the money that's moved in this region is what is called trade-based money laundering, in which you move one commodity and receive something in return. So they're not as reliant on the banking system as one might think. Secondly, with taking over Mosul, they have access to the banking system that was in place. So with the ownership or control of banks, they are able to move money. But how much of it is divided between trade activities and banking, I really can't tell you.
This all goes back to the idea of terrorists and criminals using porous borders and a lack of enforcement of money flows, really, between countries. Is that something that is increasingly helping them in the Sahel, which is a region that seems to be racked by various movements such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb?
It's basically the same principle that's operating in the Middle East, it's operating in North Africa, and it operates in other parts of the world. It's the decline of borders, the ease of moving arms, the ease of selling commodities, whether it's counterfeits, whether it's cigarettes, whether it's moving arms, that allows for this enormous instability that's emerging in many regions of the world.
I want to ask you specifically about Boko Haram, which is now facing an offensive from two neighboring countries. They've recently pledged allegiance to the Islamic State group. Do you see that as a purely rhetorical measure, or do you think it has other implications, perhaps some kind of financial tie-up with ISIS? Is that a possibility?
What's interesting is that Boko Haram has had relations with Akim, the Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb. So there have been financial relationships with other parts of Africa before. From a rhetorical point of view, I think it's more than rhetoric, because IS has such an effective media strategy and outreach strategy, and its idea of establishing a caliphate has been so appealing that Boko Haram is trying to attach itself to a winning strategy.
What have been the main sources of funding, though, so far for Boko Haram? Clearly, people smuggling is an important part of their operation.
They're very involved in people smuggling, involved in some extortion, and of movement of commodities in illicit networks.
Just to get back again to this idea of terrorists and criminals working in the age of globalization, you argue that, in your book, that in a sense, states are still stuck in an earlier period, perhaps in 20th century thinking, really along the lines of states rather than transnational dynamics. What do you think needs to change from the point of view of governments in the West, for example?
It's not just a problem of governments in the West, it's a problem of governments globally, because this is a challenge to states, especially a challenge of non-state actors, which are criminals and terrorists, and they're linked to states through corruption. But we have a rise of something that is not conceived of by the Westphalian Order, which is a state-based world structure, which is what we have through the UN. And so we're having a basic challenge to the world as we see it today, where individuals are flexible and manage to exploit a system that is much more rigid than they are.
What kind of institutions could you see, in theory, emerging in the West that would deal with these different aspects of terrorism, that's to say crime and corruption?
I think that we need to be thinking in much broader types of coalitions than just the West. We need to be thinking about how we can work with colleagues in Africa, colleagues in Asia. We need to think about how international business, which has an interest in the stability of the world and an interest in movement of licit products, can help us understand the phenomenon. We have an important role of civil society, of research and analysis. All of this is necessary. And if we keep thinking it's just the responsibility of governments and multinational institutions, we're not going to be able to deal with this problem effectively. It needs a whole of society solution, if we can think of it. But part of it in the West is also making sure that we're not receiving enormous amounts of capital from the developing world that is draining them of any capacity to provide for the youth in societies who have no opportunities and therefore are becoming frustrated and turning to crime and terrorism.
So at the moment, are we seeing just too many different institutions, perhaps non-governmental organizations, dealing with these issues, but not really working together to prevent, for example, things like money laundering, which could be helping terrorists?
We need to be thinking not only about money laundering, but also the smaller scale illicit activity, which mounts up and is an enormously important source of funds for terrorist activity. We look for the kilo of drugs that the international organizations think is there, but the attacks that occurred in France were financed by much lower level and petty crime.
Give us some more details of that. What kind of sort of small-scale illicit activities are we talking about?
What occurred and helped finance the participants in this terrorist attacks in France was trade in counterfeit Nikes. It was small-scale fraud. It's similar kinds of illicit activity that one is finding in many parts of the world that are funding terrorism.
And of course, it's difficult for people in France to realize that they're really part of this, that they're entangled in this nexus.
That's right. They keep looking for sources outside of France when some of it is this petty illicit trade that no one's paying attention to within France.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for your analysis and viewpoints, Louise Shelley, author of Dirty Entanglements, Corruption, Crime and Terrorism. That's all for this edition of The Interview here on France 24.